We don't use the word rogue nearly enough anymore. And capes, that's another thing I thought about. People should wear more capes. True, we do throw the word rogue around when we're talking about small breweries in Oregon. But when was the last time we called someone a rogue? Or rapscallion. That's another good word we don't use enough. But rogue and rapscallion, however, are the only words that do Thomas Blood, or as he called himself, Colonel Blood, justice. After all, how many people get involved in multiple plots to overthrow the government, get caught stealing the crown jewels, and still don't see the inside of a jail cell? Get ready for the tale of the infamous Thomas Blood and the crown jewels. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In this episode, we'll take a look at the astonishing life of Thomas Blood, a man who would fight on both sides of the English Civil War, both as a Roundhead and a Cavalier, arguably commit treason at least once, if not more, attempted to steal the crown jewels, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Thomas Blood was a true rogue and a rapscallion. Blood was born in the county Meath, Ireland, 1618. His father was a successful blacksmith, and his grandfather was maybe a member of parliament, but that seems to be somewhat unclear. It's entirely possible that Thomas lied about who his grandfather was in order to get on the good side of the English. There were at least two Edmund Bloods running around Ireland at the time. One, an English transplant who fought for the crown. The other, a poor farmer. Which one was in fact his grandfather would make very little difference, except that Thomas would have been able to use the name of one to gain favor among the English. He would marry the daughter of the mayor of Liverpool, a man who actually did serve in Parliament, specifically the Long Parliament, and fought for the parliamentarians in the English Civil War. So Thomas was able to find an inroad to English society through marriage. When the English Civil War broke out in 1648, Thomas served first as a cavalier fighting for King Charles I against Parliament. Then at some point in the war, most likely after seeing the tide of the war change, he switched sides and served Cromwell as an officer in Ireland. At this point, he began calling himself Captain Blood, although his actual military rank seems unclear at best. For his service, Cromwell was appointed Chief Justice and granted land in Ireland. Had the Cromwell government lasted, this might have been the last we ever heard of Thomas. But the Cromwell government wouldn't last. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Cromwell government, you're most likely an American. Let me give you a quick rundown. Charles I and Parliament had a long-running feud over just how much power the king should have and how he should use it. Charles I believed in divine right, and of course, Parliament wanted their share of power. This resulted in the English Civil War of 1648. Charles lost. Following a show trial, the former king was convicted of treason and had his head chopped off and placed on a pike on London Bridge, sending a very clear message that they were done with monarchy. After a short-lived republic that failed, then Oliver Cromwell, leader of the parliamentarians, was named Lord High Protector. This would usher in a Puritan theocracy, and like Puritans are known to do, they basically outlawed everything that might be considered slightly fun. They banned makeup, colorful dress, playing cards, most sports, and even Christmas, which they viewed as being too Catholic and too pagan. The government was held in place by Cromwell's force of personality and military might. When Oliver Cromwell died, his son Robert proved to be a poor replacement for his father and had to step aside. This would eventually lead to the restoration of the monarchy, and Charles II, who had been living in exile, would take the throne. He became known as the Merry Monarch because of his reestablishing of theater and the arts when he took the throne. For some Cromwellians, this spelled trouble. Among those who saw their fortunes turn with the restoration of the monarchy was our very own Thomas Blood. Thomas lost all the land that he'd been granted by Cromwell, so he would seek revenge by planning the kidnapping of James Butler, the Duke of Ormond, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, in 1663, in what is often called the Dublin Plot. This attempt to snatch the Duke from Dublin Castle failed miserably, and Thomas would flee to Holland. Not long after, he'd make his way to Scotland, where he fought alongside the Covenanters as they resisted change made by Charles II. This had to do with the restoration of bishops in the Church of England. Just the typical religious arguments among those oh so tolerant folks of the 1600s. It just seems like this guy wanted to fight and have something to fight about, and this was a good enough cause. He has, at this point, also, it seemed, given himself a promotion and was now calling himself Colonel Blood. This uprising would also fail, but once again, our hero would refuse to fade from history. Thomas made his way back to England, but now going by a new name and claiming to be a doctor. Of course, following the Great Fire of London in 1666, it might have been fairly easy to pass yourself off as someone new. After all, record-keeping was shoddy at best in the 1600s, but after a massive fire burns a major chunk of the city, you'd have to assume a lot of records were lost. So, in 1670, Thomas, now going by Thomas Alof, was practicing medicine in Romford, England, maybe 10 kilometers from the center of London. This was a bold move, as there was a price on his head for the Dublin Plot. But this would mean that Thomas was going to lay low. But not our Thomas. He managed to rescue a friend and co-conspirator named John Mason while he was being transported by armed guards. Then he would make a second attempt to kidnap the Duke of Ormond. So the whole I'm a doctor named Alof, not a desperate kidnapper, thief, and rebel named Blood would seem to be blown. But still, with breaking his buddy out of custody and a second failed attempt, he was still able to run around the greater London area almost like nothing had happened. While the second kidnapping failed, the story would get a little complicated as rumors spread that the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, was behind the plot and had put Blood up to the deed. This little piece of information might have played an important role later in Thomas's life and made serious trouble for Buckingham. But for now, Thomas was busy hatching his most outlandish plot yet, the theft of the crown jewels. Brief aside on the crown jewels. When the Cromwell government took over England, it was decided that the crown jewels needed to be destroyed. Oliver Cromwell viewed the jewels as a symbol of corruption and ostentatiousness of the British monarchy. The crown was melted down and the jewels were sold off. When the monarchy was restored, Charles II had a new crown jewels constructed. The crown, scepter, and orb cost a cool £100,000, an insane amount for the 1600s. Wanting to make some of that coin back, Charles then allowed people to view the crown jewels for a fee, of course. After all, have you ever heard of a monarch turning down the people's money? The jewels were housed in a special room in the basement of the Tower of London. They were behind bars, and people were allowed to view them at a safe distance. A keeper of the jewels was appointed and lived with his family a floor above the jewel room. In 1671, Talbot Edwards was the keeper of the jewels. Blood had developed his plot and recruited his co-conspirators, including members of his own family. Thomas went to view the jewels disguised as a parson. While in the jewel room, he began talking and making friends with Talbot Edwards. To Edwards, this must have seemed like a genuine friendship blooming, because Blood would later return with his wife. At this meeting, Mrs. Blood, aka Mrs. Aloff, aka the parson's wife, was struck with a subtle and debilitating stomach pain. Edwards took the Bloods to his apartment, where they stayed until the stomach pains passed. The next day, Blood, aka the parson, returned with 4 pairs of white gloves for Mrs. Edwards in payment for the kindness he had shown his wife. It was at this time that the fake parson suggested introducing Edwards' daughter to his wealthy nephew. Of course, Edwards would have jumped at this chance, being more than happy to introduce his daughter to the wealthy nephew of this kind parson. So a date was set for the meeting to take place in Edwards' apartment in the Tower of London. That date, May 9th, 1671, Thomas Blood, his nephew, actually his son Thomas Jr., and 2 other men showed up at Edwards' home for the introduction. Thomas Jr. had already started making his own career as a highwayman and would later be hung, although not for this particular crime. The nephew, again Thomas Jr., would spend time getting to know the daughter under the watchful eye of Mrs. Edwards, while the 3 men convinced Edwards to show them the crown jewels. Edwards led the group to the vault where the jewels were displayed. Just after opening the door, Edwards was struck from behind with a mallet. Blood also stabbed Edwards with a sword. Edwards was then tied up, and while he lay unconscious, Blood and the other 2 were able to remove the grate protecting the crown jewels. They then grabbed the orb, the crown, and the scepter. Now, of course, you can't just walk out of the Tower of London carrying the crown, the scepter, and the orb. Even the most incompetent of guards would notice 3 guys walking from the tower with the royal jewels. Or maybe not, of course, after learning about the story of Jack Sheppard and the princes in the tower. It seems like the guards miss a lot. But I suppose you could try telling the guards you bought these copies at the gift shop. On the off chance that didn't work, and on the off chance that they didn't have gift shops in the 1600s, someone might question, and then you had to find a way to get the crown jewels out of the tower unnoticed. So they took the mallet and flattened the crown, placed it in a bag. Then Blood shoved the orb into his pants. This, of course, would lead to the classic joke, is that an orb in your pants, or are you just happy to see me? The scepter was too long to place in a bag or shove down anyone's pants, so Blood's brother-in-law, a man named Hunt, tried to cut the scepter in half. It was at this point that Edward's son, who just happened to come home on leave from the army, came on the scene and started yelling, "Murder! Treason!" Blood and the others tried to run for it. Blood even attempted to shoot one of the guards while making the run. The escape failed when Blood was caught at the iron gate trying to exit. At this point, the story will get even crazier. It would seem that this would be the end of Blood and the others' careers, as they were caught red-handed, attempting the theft of the crown jewels, attempting the murder of Edwards and of the guard he shot at. You would think Blood would be off to a life behind bars, if not the gallows. But somehow, Thomas is going to be able to walk away from this. Authorities began questioning Blood, and he refused to talk, stating, "I'll answer to none but the king himself." Now, it was known that Charles II had a soft spot for scoundrels, or rapscallions and rogues. By the way, scoundrel, another great underused word. Blood must have known this, and also having great faith in his Irish charm. It's also worth noting that Blood might have been in possession of information about members of the royal court, such as Lord Buckingham and even the king's mistress, Barbara Palmer, who had 6 illegitimate children with Charles II, and may have had a possible role in the whole Duke of Ormond kidnapping thing. It might also be possible that Blood had served as a government agent in the Netherlands. In any case, with such powerful people urging that Blood be questioned in a less than public setting, this might make it a little less surprising that the king agreed to meet with Blood. But Blood must have been the most charming scoundrel and rogue to ever speak to the king, or maybe the king just loved a good story. At one point, Blood even reportedly told the king that he was going to assassinate the king while he was bathing in the Thames, but couldn't do it because he found himself in awe of majesty when Charles went skinny dipping and had a change of heart. The king was said to be very amused when Blood complained that the crown jewels were only worth £6,000 and not the £100,000 the king had paid for their construction. Now, it does take a case of just huge cojones to whine about the value of the thing that you were on trial for trying to steal, but that is just Thomas Blood, not denying he tried to steal the jewels, but complaining that they were worth considerably less than what people had said. Blood also would try and justify the theft by claiming he was owed for the land confiscated in Ireland. It was even pointed out how Blood had served his father in the Civil War. So Blood does have his backers. He's speaking to the king. Now, they do point out that he served his father in the Civil War. They just leave out the part about him switching sides to fight for the parliamentarians. Blood also made it clear that he could gather information on various groups across Great Britain that had opposed the king. Some in the royal court even seemed fearful that executing Blood would lead to his becoming some kind of martyr for those standing against Charles, and deemed it better to buy Blood off than to kill him. In all, the king seemed quite fond of this would-be jewel thief. When Charles asked, "What if I should give you your life?" Thomas replied, "I would endeavor to deserve it, sire." Now keep in mind that this is the same King Charles II that had issued a warrant for Blood's arrest with £100 sterling silver reward. Whatever the case, not only was Blood given a full pardon, but he was also granted land in Ireland and given a £500 a year income. Not only was he pardoned for the attempted theft, but also, quote, "of all treasonous misprisons of treason, murder, homicide, felonies," which they spelt very oddly in the original documents, assaults, batteries, also spelt kind of weird in the original document, and other offenses whatsoever at any time since 29th day of May, 1660, unquote. So by royal proclamation, all of his past crimes were just erased. All of this really seems to have pissed off Lord Ormond, who Blood had tried to kidnap twice. As Blood would start becoming a regular in the royal court, Ormond would have to see Blood often and treat him as an equal. Now, all of this seems to have been as no surprise to Ormond, who, when he heard Blood was actually going to meet with the king, predicted that a pardon would follow, because after all, he could not see why in the world the king would meet with someone like Blood, unless, of course, there was a pardon coming. It also seems that part of the deal would end up with Blood serving as a spy, or at least intermediary, with some of those who wanted to do harm to Charles. So Blood seems to have taken on the role of some sort of government agent. This not only explains the pardon, but the pension of £500 a year. As for Edwards, the keeper of the jewel, he recovered and was rewarded by the king, although evidence suggests that the full reward was never paid to him. But he would serve as keeper of the jewels for many more years after this and would have a great story to tell the visitors who came to see the jewels. Blood then somehow becomes involved in what's known as the Popish plot. Now, the Popish plot was an anti-Catholic plot that heavily used 17th century fake news to grow anti-Catholic sentiment. It was started by an Anglican church clergyman named Titus Oates. Oates had a personal hatred of Catholics, having twice been rejected by Catholic schools in France and Spain. He also, without any proof, blamed the Great Fire of London of 1666 on a Catholic plot. This was actually something that was a fairly common line following the Great Fire of London. This was somehow the fault of Catholics. But this new plot alleged the Jesuits were plotting the assassination of Charles II in an attempt to give Charles's brother, James, elevated to the throne. James was actually a practicing Catholic, and this was causing a lot of concern within halls and movers and shakers in England, especially the Protestants, as Charles II seems to have no legitimate children to take the throne, which means the throne on Charles's death would pass to James, who was, again, a practicing Catholic. Oates had at one point faked conversion to Catholicism, supposedly gaining access to Catholic meetings, and used that to give credence to his story about the Jesuits planning to assassinate the king. Oates made a sworn statement to the Justice of Peace of Westminster. Shortly after, the Justice of the Peace was found murdered, and anti-Catholic fever took off. As the Justice of the Peace was found still in possession of all of his belongings, this very violent death was clearly not a robbery. So anti-Catholic sentiment would grow dramatically as people believed that the Justice of the Peace must have had some proof of the Catholic plot. So with the growing anti-Catholic sentiment, it was easy to blame the Catholics, although it was just as likely that the Justice of the Peace was killed to further Oates's claims. Eventually, Oates was brought before the king's privy council, and after questioning, it became obvious that Oates was making the whole thing up. Unfortunately, before Oates was discredited, 35 innocent people had been executed. It seems that Blood may have been acting as a spy during this time period, and at some point slandered the Duke of Buckingham. Told you he'd come back. It seems at one point Blood was working to discredit Oates, who he saw as a tool of extreme elements with possible ties to an attempted Puritan resurgence. He might have even had a hand in the downfall of Oates, who ultimately received a fine of £100,000 and a prison sentence for the entire Popish plot. Now things get truly nuts. A plot formed to attack Buckingham and have him removed from the court. Not sure what they had against Buckingham, but they seem to have really hated him. The plot centered around having Buckingham charged with buggery and sodomy, and several people seem to have been offered bribes to testify against Buckingham, though instead they got word to Buckingham of what was going on. Now watching others go down from false accusations, this would clearly be more than just a question of honor. Under buggery laws, this could carry the sentence of death. Buckingham would deny any scandalous tales being told about him and claimed that Blood had committed slander. It was Blood who seems to have been at the forefront of the attack on Buckingham. It is not totally clear as to why Blood would have turned on Buckingham, a man once thought to be his friend. This was taken to court, and Blood was actually found at fault and ordered to pay Buckingham £10,000. As for Buckingham's other accusers, they were also found guilty and fined and given various stints in jail. One woman was even sent to the pillory, aka the stocks, and had people rejoice in throwing rotten vegetables and eggs at her. However, less than a year later, Blood became ill and died, having never paid Buckingham what he was owed. Rumors spread that Blood had faked his death to avoid paying Buckingham. And who wouldn't believe it? After all, he had managed time and time again to get away with literal murder. So his body was actually exhumed when they discovered he was, in fact, dead and buried. So Buckingham never got his £10,000. Of Blood's 6 children, only 2 really make their mark in the historical record. His son Thomas, who became a highwayman and was actually executed before his father, even though Thomas Jr. was part of the pardon that was given by Charles II. Then his younger son, Holcroft Blood, who would serve with great distinction in the armies of Great Britain, rising to the rank of brigadier general before his death in 1707. When all is said and done, Thomas Blood had done it all. Rebel, spy, soldier, jewel thief. His roguish wit and charm had kept him out of prison for any real amount of time, and his neck out of the gallows. He remains the only person to have ever stolen the crown jewels, and he managed to talk his way out of jail for that. Some even saw his death as a calculated attempt to avoid punishment. He would truly live up to the title rogue and scoundrel. I'd like to give a shout out to some of our sources used in this episode: Thomas Blood and the Theft of the Crown Jewels, HistoryUK.com, TheRoyalMint.com, WestminsterAbbey.com, Britannia.com, and The Audacious Crimes of Colonel Blood, the spy who stole the crown jewels and became the king's secret agent. Please join us next time as we take a look at werewolves, witches, and vampires. Oh my. Until then, this has been History is Criminal.